Okay, guys, welcome back. How was the exercise? Did you enjoy it? Was anything surprising in terms of what you found was an assumption? Or perhaps, did anyone here have an assumption that other people did not share about a particular environment? Anyone have that sort of happen? Or did you all have pretty much the same assumptions about the environments that you were talking about? Slightly different, but more or less the same, right? So what's happening here is it's to do with cultural biases. In every culture, there will be different assumptions about what certain things mean and what happens there, right? So as you move across cultures, of course, a lot of these assumptions will fall apart. That's where things like cultural clashes and all these sort of things happen. Does that make sense? It's very important. Remember, we keep talking about how you have to set the hypnotic context. Well, the hypnotic context is a frame. It's letting people know, on a, shall we say, unconscious level, what the expectations are. It's kind of like a stage show. I mean, what are some of the assumptions in a stage show? Well, in one, the hypnotist has some special power. Isn't that an assumption? And it's implied. Very rarely do the hypnotists nowadays say it. It's still implied. People go there and they go, oh, I wonder what he's going to make me do. If they accept the assumption that someone can make you do something, well, he can make you do something. Does that make sense? I saw, there's a great example of this in a film that just came out recently. Has anyone here seen Dinner for Schmucks? It's a hysterical movie. But there is a classic scene within that which defines exactly what we're talking about. There is one of the characters in that believes that his colleague, his work colleague, can control his mind, right? And of course the guy's sitting there going, Barry, tell me whatever it is, right? And Barry's going, no, no, no. And of course then he ends up telling him. Why? The pressure is coming from inside himself. He's fighting his own expectations. Does that make sense? So our job is to understand what are the expectations that are present when we enter an environment so that we can utilize those which are in our favor and we can neutralize those that are not. Make sense? So here's some of the classic strategies for doing that. First of all, we have the idea of a pre-frame. A pre-frame sets the context up front so that the assumptions already change before you begin and everything, well, the difficulties don't begin to run from that point forwards. Here's an example. You are sitting at a table with friends and you have a discussion about maybe some problem with the water supply, right? You're sitting at a table with enemies and you're having a discussion about a problem with your water supply. How does that change? Do you see where I'm going with this? And by the way, this is very important because our pre-frames can happen unconsciously. In other words, we will project certain qualities onto others and unconsciously reinforce them. Remember the feedback loop? That happens unconsciously with a lot of people. An example of this is back, I think it was in the 1970s. These studies can't be done anymore for ethical reasons. The researchers went into I think it was a school or it could be a university, and they gave a bunch of students a fake aptitude test for whatever subject it was. They didn't score the test properly. They just basically gave them ascribed random results, and they didn't even give the students the results. They only gave it to their teachers and the principals. They said basically, these kids are geniuses. They're going to fly. Don't take any stick from them. These kids are really no-hopers. Do your best, but don't expect too much. The kids never found out their scores. At the end of the year, the results that came in, not all of them of course, but the results that came in were mostly in correlation to the fake aptitude test results. Why? Because the teacher's expectations set a pre-frame in the classroom. They taught differently. They interacted differently. They marked differently. They corrected differently. They assumed different things, and so the behaviors that they got back were different. Does that make sense? Then we have the idea of reframing. Reframing is what you do when a problem comes your way and you need to change it. In other words, you suddenly realize there's a frame here that is not really working, and typically it's when someone has an objection of some sort, and you present an alternative point of view so that it changes it. For example, these are not your enemies sitting at the table, these are your friends. Because you all have the same problem right now. With no water, you're all pretty much screwed. So you may as well work together. That's an example of a reframe. Do you see how that works? We're switching enemies towards friends because you have a common goal, a common good that you're working towards. See how that works? Well, we'll look at these all in a little bit more detail as we go through. Then we have the outframe. The outframe is a pretty sneaky thing that happens. You'll see this happening a fair amount in politics, believe it or not, but it can happen in many other places as well. Basically, an outframe says, whatever problems you're bringing to the table really aren't the real problem. There's a much more important thing at hand. So you're basically trumping it. A classic example, and this has happened throughout history, is when the economy fails, start a war, right? We're at war, folks. Don't pay attention to all the mess that's happening at home. We're at war. We need your support. You'll be unpatriotic not to support us, and so on and so forth. Can you see the frames that are being created at that point, right? So do you understand the basics of frame control? Pre-framing, reframing, and outframing. Those are the three core ideas. Of the three, my preference is the pre-frame, because these can be the most invisible and the ones that will tend to cause you the least problems over time, because the problems don't arise. If you can have a reasonable guess as to what assumptions, expectations, what frames people are walking into a particular meeting or event with, and you can pre-frame them in such a way that those assumptions are no longer there. In other words, they adopt a new set of assumptions before they even realize it, then all the classic problems start to disappear. This is true in sales, in teaching, in relationships, and everything. Make sense?
So, are you saying we reframe the pre-frame?
So the question is, do you reframe the pre-frame? So the pre-frame is kind of like a reframe done before you need it, right? So you're basically, I know, it gets a little mind-bending, right? Let me give you an illustration. Of course, Mickey and I talked about this before. You see this magic box?
Yep.
This is the frame of reference that people are coming in with, right? Now, either you can enter the frame of reference, and because there are corners here, when you get to the corner, you may have to do something to break through. That's called a reframe. If, however, before any of this happens, you realize that a box exists, so before you even enter, you do something to neutralize that. For example, you start here, and you make a big circle out of it. These corners have now disappeared. When you now get to this corner here, there is no resistance. There's no pushback. There's no objection. Why? Because this corner no longer exists inside their mind. You have pre-framed. You've created something ahead of time to take care of that. Does that make sense? Now, in any situation that you'll find yourself in, and we'll get into this more as the day progresses, you'll find that it's only usually, 4 or 5 major assumptions or concerns or needs that people have that you need to address, right? You don't have to know everything at once, just the major things. For example, when you're in a hospital, when there's a patient in a hospital, what kind of things are their major concerns, right? Life. Is this going to be healthy, or are they going to be healthy at the end of this? Are they going to survive this? Possibly cost. Are they going to have to sell their children to be able to afford this? Right? Pain or inconvenience, things like that. How long, how much effort, that sort of stuff. Beyond that, there's really not that much else. What's wrong with me? How can I fix it? Those are the main ideas that are driving them, right? Now, if you're a doctor and the idea of the patient is, what pill can you give me to fix this? And your answer is, the pill isn't what you need. What you need is, say, a particular exercise routine. You might turn around and say, you need to exercise more, or you need to eat less, or else your heart will explode. Doctors say that sort of stuff, right? The problem is, the patients don't follow the advice. Why? Because they're sitting within a set of assumptions already. They're already thinking like, oh, but food is good, and yada, and so on and so forth. He has to be able to build up to the advice that they need to stop eating as much or eating different food and so on, so they can live longer and healthier. Does that make sense? If he sets that advice up ahead of time, the expectation that people who change their lifestyle then don't need surgery, they don't need these strange machines to keep them alive and all the rest of it, and that's accepted already, that is a pre-frame. They've accepted the idea that a lifestyle change needs to occur, long before he even introduces the idea that you specifically have to adopt a lifestyle change. So then the likelihood that they're actually going to adopt a lifestyle change themselves, when he actually says, you know, change your diet, are much higher. Does that make sense? So do you get the idea of pre-framing versus reframing and an outframing? Okay. So